Parents said, "You're not welcome." I was erased from her wedding. 20 years of favoritism. Then I found Mom's journal. The champagne-colored envelope trembled between my fingers, heavy with its silent verdict. I traced my fingertips over my sister Talise's name embossed in copper foil that caught the late afternoon light streaming through my apartment blinds. Our parents, Victor and Eleanor Crawford, listed as proud hosts. My cousin Nadia's name, my uncle Stephen's, even my mother's book club friend who'd met Talise exactly twice. Every name except mine. The envelope carried my mother's signature lavender scent. Once comforting, now suffocating, as the truth crystallized. I'd been deliberately erased from my only sister's wedding. My parents had poured $75,000 into Talise's vineyard wedding, but told me I wasn't welcome because I wasn't the golden child. I held the invitation up to the window as if light might reveal my name hidden in the watermark, watching dust particles dance through the sunbeam like the remnants of a life where I belonged. 20 years of being invisible, and now they had literally crossed me out of our family's defining celebration. I swept my arm across my kitchen counter, sending the invitation sliding into my trash can where it landed with a hollow thud that echoed through my empty apartment. The sound triggered a memory. Myself, at 8 years old, watching my science fair medal, third place, still an achievement, being tossed into my father's desk drawer while Talise's soccer participation trophy was mounted on the living room wall. What would you do if your family decided you weren't worthy of witnessing their most important celebration? What would you do if the people who gave you life never actually saw you? As I knelt on my faded rug, surrounded by childhood mementos I'd foolishly preserved, my phone illuminated with wedding photos from distant relatives already receiving their invitations. My hands shook as I scrolled through images of elegant vineyard venues and sample menus, each picture a reminder of the celebration I wouldn't witness. But the text message Talise sent 3 months after her wedding would unearth a truth so devastating it would finally explain my lifelong exile, a family secret hidden in Eleanor Crawford's leather-bound journals that revealed why I was always the shadow to my sister's light. "Kaya, you're blocking your sister in the frame. Move to the side." My mother's instructions during our annual Christmas photo sessions became so predictable I could silently mouth the words before she spoke them. Her voice always carried that distinctive edge, not quite irritation, not quite disappointment, but a tone reserved exclusively for me. I can still feel the stiff collar of the emerald green dress she'd selected for that particular Christmas photo when I was 12, Talise in identical fabric, but somehow the style flattered her, while mine emphasized my awkward adolescent angles. As I shifted to the periphery of the frame, my father nodded with approval. That's better. Now Talise is centered properly. Every Crawford Christmas card featured the same composition. Talise front and center, her academic achiever smile gleaming between our parents' proud faces, while I hovered at the edges, my artistic nature deemed difficult to photograph properly. Through these annual photographs, I watched myself gradually fade from the center to the margins of our family narrative, one shutter click at a time. Our Pasadena home stood as a monument to perfection, Spanish-style architecture with terracotta tiles and meticulously maintained gardens that served as background for neighborhood association gatherings. Inside those immaculate walls, our family operated on an unspoken hierarchy that visitors might not immediately notice, but every member intimately understood. My father, Victor, built his investment banking career on precision and expected the same in his home life. My mother, Eleanor, had abandoned her promising career in art history to become the quintessential banker's wife, channeling her suppressed creative instincts into aggressive garden cultivation and ruthlessly organized charity events. The scent of my mother's lemon furniture polish still triggers a visceral anxiety in me. That smell meant inspection, evaluation, and inevitable disappointment. I remember one Sunday afternoon when I was 9, proudly showing her a watercolor I'd painted of our garden. She glanced at it briefly, her lips tightening almost imperceptibly. The perspective is off, Kaya. The flowers in the back should be smaller. She then turned to admire Talisa's math worksheet with effusive praise. Look how neatly you've shown your work. Your father will be so proud. The pattern revealed itself in 1,000 small moments that accumulated in my psyche like toxic sediment. Christmas mornings when Talise unwrapped the latest computer or scientific calculator while I received craft supplies. Since you enjoy that sort of thing, my father would explain with dismissive benevolence. The subtle shift in my mother's voice when she introduced us to new acquaintances. This is Talise, she's first in her class, followed by a flatter, and this is Kaya, our oldest. For my 16th birthday, my parents gave me art supplies from a discount store and a $50 gift card tucked into a card signed only by my mother. 6 weeks later, when Talise turned 14, they transformed our backyard into a fairy tale wonderland with professional lighting, hired a popular local band, and gifted her a custom-designed dress that cost more than all my birthdays combined. I can still hear the crystal glasses clinking as adults toasted Talise's bright future while I served punch to guests. When I dared question the disparity, my mother's explanation landed like a predetermined verdict. Talise is more social, honey. You wouldn't have enjoyed that kind of attention. Their justifications always reframed their favoritism as consideration for my different temperament, as if my exclusion were a kindness rather than a wound. My high school graduation remains burned in my memory with physical clarity. The auditorium air was thick with June heat and the mingled scents of drugstore perfumes. When I crossed the stage to receive honors in visual arts, squinting through stage lights to find my family, I spotted my father's expensive camera raised to capture the moment. Later, reviewing the photos, I discovered the truth his viewfinder had revealed. In every image, Talise was in sharp focus in the foreground, while I appeared as a blurred figure in cap and gown. That evening, as relatives dropped by with congratulations, I watched my father press a crisp $200 gift card into Talise's hand for supporting your sister through her senior year. I received a mass-produced card with a generic message about new beginnings, the space for a personal note conspicuously blank. I remember locking myself in the bathroom, running the shower to mask the sound of my sobs, while the murmur of continued celebration drifted through the door. My grandmother, my mother's mother, and my only ally noticed everything. During a rare visit, my parents limited her time with us, uncomfortable with her excessive cultural expressions. She pulled me into the garden while the others prepared dinner inside. The jasmine was in bloom, its sweet scent a sharp contrast to our conversation. They don't see your light, Kimimila, she whispered, using the Lakota name she'd given me at birth. Butterfly, a name my parents never used. Her weathered hands cupped my face, thumbs gently wiping away tears I hadn't realized were falling. Some eyes can only perceive certain colors of the spectrum. The fault lies in their vision, not in your brightness. My grandmother was the only one who honored my mother's indigenous heritage, something my status-conscious parents had systematically erased in their pursuit of assimilation into Pasadena's old money circles. She taught me to bead in secret, creating patterns that told stories without words. When she died during my sophomore year of college, I lost my only witness, the only person who saw me clearly and loved what she saw. At her funeral, my mother wept briefly but appropriately, while I felt a grief so profound it seemed to alter my physical form. College exposed the financial dimension of their favoritism with brutal clarity. My acceptance to Rhode Island School of Design came with a half scholarship, a significant achievement that my parents acknowledged with the enthusiasm they might show for a mediocre weather forecast. Art school is a luxury, Kaya, my father declared during a tense dinner discussion, the scent of my mother's roast beef growing cold as the argument heated. Take out loans like responsible adults do. It builds character. His tone suggested character was something I particularly lacked. When Talise was accepted to UCLA the following year, my parents not only covered her full tuition, but bought her a new Prius to make commuting easier and funded her sorority dues for the networking opportunities. The day they surprised her with a car, pearl white with a red bow, I watched from my bedroom window, then returned to calculating how many waitressing shifts I'd need to cover next semester's books. I worked 3 jobs between classes: barista at dawn, gallery assistant on weekends, graphic design intern whenever I could squeeze in hours. My clothes came from thrift stores while Talise's Instagram showcased shopping sprees at Nordstrom, captioned with "Mom's taste is the best. Mock blessed," that made my stomach clench with a jealousy I hated myself for feeling. The disparity followed us into adulthood with mathematical precision. When Talise graduated and entered the corporate world, our parents gave her a $60,000 down payment for a condo as a graduation gift. When I was laid off during a company downsizing and struggled to make rent on my tiny Echo Park apartment, my mother suggested I manage my finances better and consider a more stable career path. The pattern was so established that I learned to predict its manifestations with tragic accuracy. During a family dinner celebrating my father's promotion, I mentioned landing a design contract with a recognizable tech startup. "That's nice, honey," my mother responded with practiced politeness, barely looking up from rearranging her asparagus spears. Moments later, Talise announced a minor responsibility change at her corporate job, and both parents erupted in enthusiastic questions and congratulations. Under the table, I dug my fingernails into my palm until I felt the sharp crescent moons of pain, anything to keep from screaming the obvious inequality that no one would acknowledge. "When will you outgrow this need for attention?" my mother once asked when I quietly pointed out the disparity in their responses. That single question crystallized everything. My legitimate desire for equal recognition had been pathologized into an inappropriate need. My feelings were always the problem, never their behavior. Yet despite the mountain of evidence, I still hungered for their approval like a starving person dreams of bread. I believed if I just achieved enough professional success, if my design work won enough awards, or my client list became sufficiently prestigious, I would finally cross some invisible threshold of worthiness. Every career advancement was unconsciously dedicated to finally being enough for Victor and Eleanor Crawford. As my design business grew, I carefully curated social media posts that might impress them, selecting projects that aligned with their values. I kept my apartment in neutral tones that wouldn't offend my mother's sensibilities during her infrequent visits. I chose clothes for family gatherings that mimicked my sister's conservative style rather than expressing my actual preferences. I became a chameleon, constantly adapting to an environment that remained hostile no matter how perfectly I blended in. But the wedding exclusion wasn't just another slight in a lifetime collection of small rejections. It was the final, undeniable proof that nothing I could ever do would be sufficient. And strangely, that realization would ultimately become my salvation. I discovered I wasn't invited to Talise's wedding on the hottest day of June, 103 degrees in Los Angeles, the kind of heat that warps asphalt and judgment equally. My ancient window unit had surrendered with a pathetic wheeze that morning, leaving my apartment an airless oven. Desperate to finish a client deadline in habitable conditions, I drove to my parents' house unannounced, a rare breach of the carefully maintained boundaries I normally observed. Their Pasadena home sat cool and quiet under massive oak trees, central air humming efficiently. I used my key, kept for emergencies, almost never used, and slipped inside, calling out a tentative hello that echoed through marble-floored hallways. The house smelled of my mother's signature lemon furniture polish and fresh-cut hydrangeas, scents that instantly transported me back to childhood anxiety. I found my mother in the kitchen, her reading glasses perched precisely on her nose as she scrolled through photos on her iPad. "The ceremony space looks absolutely magical with those hanging lights," she said into her phone, her voice animated with an enthusiasm I rarely heard directed at me. "And the vineyard backdrop will photograph beautifully at sunset. Talise will look like a magazine cover." She startled when she noticed me in the doorway, her hand instinctively moving to close the iPad case with a decisive snap that punctuated my unwelcome presence. "Kaya, I didn't hear you come in." Her voice shifted instantly to the controlled politeness she reserved for unexpected visitors and service providers. "Sorry to drop by without calling," I said, explaining about my air conditioning crisis and looming deadline. "I just need a cool place to work for a few hours." "Of course," she said with the automatic hospitality that was more social reflex than genuine welcome. As she spoke, I noticed a stack of thick champagne envelopes on the counter, identical to the sample Talise had texted me months earlier while researching invitation options. My stomach tightened as I counted at least 30 addresses waiting for stamps. "Those are Talise's wedding invitations?" I asked, striving for casual interest despite the sudden dryness in my throat. "Yes," my mother answered, gathering them into a precise stack with manicured fingers tipped in pale pink polish, the same color as the peonies she'd been discussing for centerpieces during our last family dinner. "Just finalizing the last batch." "When are they going out?" I asked, the question sounding distant through the sudden rushing in my ears. "The main group went out last week," she replied, not meeting my eyes as she aligned the envelopes with geometric precision against the counter edge. "These are just supplemental." I stood very still, the kitchen's cool air suddenly insufficient as realization dawned. "Did mine get lost?" I asked, the question deliberately naive though I already knew the answer. The silence that followed seemed to compress all the oxygen from the room. 5 seconds that contained 20 years of accumulated disappointment before my mother finally spoke. "Kaya," she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd grown to dread, "the venue has limited capacity. Talise and Derek wanted an intimate celebration." "Intimate," I repeated, the word hollow. "But you and Dad are invited, and the neighbors and Dad's golf partners." "It's her special day," my mother replied, defensive edges sharpening her words. "She wants it perfect. You know how you are, always so sensitive about family dynamics, always making things about your feelings." The familiar accusation hit like a physical blow, the same invalidation they'd weaponized throughout my childhood. My very real hurt always reframed as my personal defect. "How I am," I echoed, voice rising despite my attempt at control. "I'm your daughter." "Talise has always been the responsible one," my mother continued, her fingers nervously straightening the invitations. "Your artistic temperament might make things uncomfortable for everyone. It's not personal." "Not personal?" I repeated, incredulity cracking my voice. "Excluding your firstborn child from her only sister's wedding is the definition of personal." "You've always been so dramatic," my mother sighed, employing another familiar dismissal. "This is exactly the reaction we were concerned about." "You've always favored her," I said, the tremor in my voice betraying the childhood wound beneath my adult indignation. "I tried my whole life to be good enough for you and Dad." "That's not true," my mother insisted, color blooming across her cheekbones. "We love you both equally, but this is Talise's day. Not everything is about you, Kaya." My father appeared in the doorway as our voices escalated, his tall frame filling the space like a physical manifestation of his authority. Unlike my mother, whose anger energized her, my father's disappointment had always manifested as cold withdrawal, a glacial absence more devastating than any shouting could be. "What's going on?" he asked, though the tension in the room told him everything he needed to know. "Kaya is upset about the wedding invitations," my mother explained with pointed brevity. My father cleared his throat, his universal stalling tactic, and adjusted his glasses before speaking. "The guest list was Talise and Derek's decision," he said, employing the corporate passive voice that had always allowed him to distance himself from family conflicts. "Perhaps if you and your sister had a closer relationship, that suggestion, that the fault lay with me for failing to secure a place at my own sister's wedding through insufficient sisterly devotion, ignited something primal within me." 20 years of swallowed responses erupted. "A closer relationship?" I repeated, my voice dropping dangerously low. You've orchestrated our entire lives to create competition, not closeness. You've consistently rewarded her and punished me for the same achievements. You've funded her education, her home, her wedding, while telling me to stand on my own. And you have the audacity to suggest the problem is my failure to connect? My father's face hardened, the corporate executive replacing the father. I think you should leave if you can't discuss this rationally, he said, his voice cold with finality. You're upsetting your mother. I left, my laptop still sitting forgotten on their kitchen counter, sacred professional deadlines suddenly meaningless compared to this fresh wound. I drove aimlessly through Pasadena's tree-lined streets, eventually parking at the Rose Garden where my high school graduation photos had been taken. Talise prominently featured in most of those images too. Hours later, I returned to my parents' house to retrieve my computer, using my key to slip in quietly. The house was silent except for my mother's voice drifting down from their bedroom upstairs, sharp with irritation. Talise, your sister found out about the wedding, she was saying, unaware of my presence below. No, I didn't tell her. She saw the invitations. Well, what was I supposed to say? That you specifically didn't want her there? I know. Kaya would just make it about her art or her problems. You deserve one day without her drama. Yes, we'll make sure she doesn't show up uninvited. Don't worry, your day will be perfect. Those words, so casual in their cruelty, crystallized a lifetime of being the family outcast. I stood frozen in the darkened living room, my body physically present, while something essential within me finally broke free. The desperate need for their approval that had driven me my entire life suddenly lifted like a fog burning away, revealing a landscape I'd never been able to see clearly before. I walked to the antique sideboard, where generations of Crawford family photos created a visual history. My fingers found a silver frame containing an image from my childhood, Talise and me at Huntington Beach when I was 7 and she was 5. We were building sandcastles, my arm protectively around her smaller shoulders as I showed her how to pack wet sand for stronger towers. Our parents were nowhere in the frame, just two sisters with identical smiles that reached their eyes before the weight of favoritism had crushed our bond. When my parents came downstairs, drawn by some sixth sense that their carefully ordered home had been disrupted, I was waiting. My mother's face registered surprise, then wariness. My father looked tired, the lines around his mouth deeper in the soft lamplight. 20 years of trying to earn your love, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I'd ever heard it, and I finally see it was never available to me. My mother started to speak, another well-rehearsed denial forming on her lips, but I held up my hand in a gesture so uncharacteristically assertive that it actually silenced her. Keep the memories, I said, placing the beach photo face down on the sideboard. They were never real anyway. I walked past them toward the door, the sound of my footsteps on the hardwood floor breaking the stunned silence. These floors my father had installed himself the summer before I left for college, a home improvement project he'd never invited me to help with, unlike the boat he and Talise had restored together the year before her departure. Kaya, you're overreacting again, my mother called after me, her voice sharp with the familiar accusation that had defined me since childhood. I paused at the threshold, my hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. The scent of evening jasmine drifted in from their perfectly maintained garden, unexpectedly sweet against the bitterness of the moment. No, Mother, I said softly. For the first time, I'm seeing clearly. I walked out into the warm California twilight, crickets beginning their evening chorus as fireflies blinked in the hedges, tiny lights appearing and disappearing like the approval I'd chased for decades. My steps felt strangely weightless, as if I'd set down a burden I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it wasn't actually part of me. Getting into my car, I expected tears, but they didn't come. Instead, I felt a curious lightness, not happiness exactly, but the weightless sensation of release. The heaviest chains, after all, are the ones we don't realize we're wearing until they fall away. The headlights of my car cut through evening fog as I drove away from my childhood home, the mist transforming familiar streets into an alien landscape, a perfect metaphor for how different the world looked now that I'd finally stopped pretending. I pulled into the empty parking lot of a closed grocery store, my hands shaking so badly I could barely shift into park. The digital clock on my dashboard read 9:17 p.m. I would forever remember this precise moment as the dividing line between my old life and whatever came next. I called my friend Zoe, the only person who had witnessed the full extent of my family dynamic over the years. "They didn't invite me to Talisa's wedding," I said when she answered, the words sounding surreal as I spoke them aloud for the first time. "My own sister's wedding, and I've been officially excluded." "I'm ordering Thai food and opening wine," Zoe replied without hesitation, the background noise telling me she was already grabbing her keys. "Come over, now." 20 minutes later, I climbed the stairs to Zoe's Silver Lake apartment, each step requiring deliberate focus as if I'd forgotten how my body worked. The scent of curry and coconut milk greeted me before she opened the door. Comfort food ordered from our favorite restaurant. While my own apartment maintained the neutral palette and minimal decor that might someday win Eleanor Crawford's approval, Zoe's home exploded with personality. Exactly the kind of cluttered and undisciplined space my mother would disapprove of. Vintage concert posters covered the walls, plants sprawled from macrame hangers, and mismatched furniture created cozy conversation nooks. It was everything my mother would hate, but that secretly represented the authenticity I craved. That night, curled on Zoe's purple velvet couch under a weighted blanket that felt like armor, I released years of accumulated pain. The Thai food grew cold in its containers as I talked, reaching back to my earliest memories of differential treatment. "I've tried everything," I whispered, the wine in my glass untouched. "I excelled academically, but in the wrong subjects. I built a successful business, but not in the corporate world they value. I've been responsible, independent, creative, but never in ways they could recognize as worthy. Maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with me," I added, voicing the fear that had shadowed me since childhood. "Maybe I'm inherently too difficult to love." Zoe set down her wine glass with such force that red liquid sloshed onto her coffee table. She didn't bother to wipe it up, a small act of domestic rebellion that my mother would have found appalling. "Stop," she said fiercely. "Your parents' inability to love you equally isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their limitations. Full stop." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through photos. Me teaching art to refugee children at a community center, presenting designs at a gallery opening, receiving recognition for work that had helped a nonprofit double their fundraising. "This is who you are," she said, showing me image after image of a life my parents had never truly seen. "This person deserves to be celebrated. This person deserves to be witnessed." That night on Zoe's couch became the first stepping stone on my healing path. The next morning, I performed an act both symbolic and terrifying. I deleted most family photos from my phone and social media. Not in anger, but in self-preservation. Each artificially harmonious image was a gaslighting tool, contradicting my lived experience and perpetuating the fiction that we were a normal, loving family. I unfollowed Talise on Instagram, unable to bear the inevitable stream of wedding planning posts that would prominently feature our parents' adoration. As the wedding date approached, my body registered the stress before my mind could process it. I developed insomnia, waking at 3 a.m. with my heart racing as if I'd been running. My appetite disappeared, food turning to ash in my mouth. I found myself avoiding social media entirely, afraid of stumbling across wedding updates from mutual acquaintances. Even driving past certain restaurants or shops Talise frequented sent a jolt of anxiety through my system. Rather than sitting home alone, measuring the dimensions of my exclusion on the actual wedding day, I made an impulsive decision. I booked a beach house in Malibu for the entire wedding weekend, an extravagance that would strain my budget but felt symbolically essential. When the confirmation email arrived with photos of a sunlit deck overlooking the Pacific, I felt a fierce satisfaction. While my sister celebrated with my parents' blessing and financial support, I would create my own ritual of liberation. The morning of Talisa's wedding dawned with the kind of spectacular coastal sunrise that travel magazines feature on covers, bands of gold and pink stretching across an ocean that sparkled like crushed diamonds. I sat cross-legged on the deck of the beach house, sketchbook open on my lap, watching early surfers carve through perfect waves. The rhythmic sound of the ocean seemed to wash through my thoughts, clearing space for a question that suddenly seemed profound in its simplicity. Today my sister marries while I heal by the ocean. Which of us is truly blessed? For the first time, I genuinely questioned whether Talisa's golden child status had given her what she most needed, the ability to recognize her own worth separate from our parents' validation. Had their excessive attention and approval actually stunted her in ways I couldn't see? Had my struggles forced a self-reliance and authenticity she might never develop? The thought wasn't spiteful, just a quiet recognition that perhaps being overlooked had given me gifts I was only beginning to recognize. Throughout that weekend, I channeled my emotions into art, something I hadn't done purely for myself since before college, when creation became commodified into marketable skills. I bought large canvases and professional-grade acrylics from an art supply store in Malibu, setting them up on the beach house deck. With no client brief, no strategic goal, no target audience, just pure emotional expression, I painted with a freedom I hadn't felt in years. The first canvas captured the confusion of childhood, dark, tangled lines surrounding a small, bright center that struggled to expand but was repeatedly contained. My hands worked almost independently of conscious thought, colors mixing on the palette in combinations I hadn't planned. The second canvas expressed the rage of adolescence, jagged red streaks cutting across oppressive gray spaces that threatened to consume everything. I painted until my shoulder ached, sweat and tears mingling on my face in the afternoon sun. The third canvas began similarly, but transformed into something unexpected. The chaotic elements gradually organizing around a central golden form that seemed to emerge from within the darkness rather than being imposed from outside. As I worked on this final piece, the sun setting behind me cast my shadow across the canvas, my body becoming part of the composition in a way that felt oddly significant. On Sunday evening, as the sun set on what would have been the final day of Talisa's wedding weekend, I photographed the progression of paintings and posted them on my professional Instagram without explanation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments and messages poured in about the emotional journey visible in the work. A design client who followed my personal account reached out privately. "There's something powerful happening in these pieces that wasn't in your commercial work. Would you consider creating something with this raw energy for our mental health app? Our users need to see transformation like this." That inquiry led to others. Something had shifted in my work, a depth and authenticity that connected with viewers in ways my more technically perfect but emotionally restrained commercial designs hadn't. The irony wasn't lost on me. Being excluded from the family wedding was somehow freeing my authentic creative voice. The very artistic temperament my mother had dismissed as inappropriate for formal occasions was becoming my greatest professional asset. When I returned to Los Angeles, I found a therapist who specialized in family trauma. Dr. Nolan was a composed Black woman whose office felt like a continuation of my beach sanctuary. Plants thriving in filtered sunlight, comfortable furniture that invited honest conversation, and walls adorned with powerful abstract art that seemed to express exactly what I'd been trying to capture in my own paintings. Family favoritism creates a particular kind of wound, she explained during our third session, her voice rich with compassion but free of pity. It's not just about the material disparities, though those certainly matter. It's about the fundamental message sent to the non-favored child that your worthiness is eternally conditional, while your siblings is inherent. She helped me recognize how deeply the favoritism had shaped my identity and choices. How I'd become a professional chameleon, constantly shifting my presentation in hopes of finally displaying the correct combination of traits that would unlock my parents' love. How I'd chosen a creative career that could be solitary to avoid the pain of being overlooked in groups. How I'd even arranged my apartment in neutral tones that wouldn't offend my parents' sensibilities during their rare visits. "You've been trying to earn conditional love," Dr. Nolan explained, leaning forward slightly to emphasize her point. "But conditional love can never be truly earned because the conditions keep changing. They're not based on your actions, but on your parents' internal needs." In those weekly sessions, seated in a sunbeam that warmed my shoulders like a comforting hand, I began to recognize that my parents' treatment wasn't just about me and Talise. It was about their own unresolved issues and limitations. My mother's abandoned artistic dreams projected onto me as disappointment. My father's need for predictable success that Talise provided and my creativity threatened. Their approval was never mine to earn, I realized in one breakthrough session, the words emerging with the force of revelation. The flaw was in their inability to love completely, not in me. As summer faded into fall, I deliberately built new traditions and connections that honored my authentic self rather than the performance I'd maintained for my parents. Sunday brunches with friends from the art community replaced the obligatory family dinners I'd endured monthly. I joined a collaborative studio space downtown where creative energy flowed freely between photographers, painters, and designers without judgment or comparison. Most healing of all, I started teaching free art workshops at a community center for kids from underserved neighborhoods, children whose creative gifts weren't always recognized or supported at home. "You see me," a 10-year-old girl with extraordinary talent said one afternoon as I knelt beside her, helping her mix colors to achieve exactly the shade of purple she envisioned. The simple phrase brought unexpected tears to my eyes. To be seen, truly seen, was perhaps all I had ever wanted from my parents. My apartment transformed alongside my internal landscape. I painted the kitchen wall a deep teal that made me smile every morning. I hung string lights across my small balcony and filled bookshelves with art volumes my father had once dismissed as coffee table decoration, not real literature. I framed and displayed my own artwork prominently, including the beach house triptych that had marked my turning point. The most unexpected healing came from reconnecting with my grandmother's legacy. In a small wooden box I'd kept since her death, I found a beaded bracelet she had made for me, intricate Lakota patterns in blues and golds that she said represented the path between earth and sky. I began wearing it daily, the weight on my wrist a constant reminder of her words. "Remember who you are, Kimamila. Your worth was never in question." With Dr. Nolan's encouragement, I researched more about my Lakota heritage, the part of my identity my parents had actively discouraged me from exploring. I joined an Indigenous artists collective that met monthly, bringing my commercial design skills to help promote their traditional works to broader audiences. The elders in the group recognized my grandmother's beadwork patterns immediately, creating an unexpected connection to her that transcended her physical absence. I was building a life defined by my choices rather than my family's rejection when, 3 months after her wedding, Talise's name appeared on my phone screen with a message that would shatter everything I thought I knew about our family. The text arrived on a Tuesday afternoon as golden October light slanted through my studio windows. I was sketching concepts for a new client when my phone lit up with Talise's name, the first contact since before her wedding. My hands trembled as I stared at the notification, unexpected adrenaline flooding my system like a physical reminder of how deeply my family's conditioning remained embedded in my nervous system. For several minutes I couldn't bring myself to open the message. What new hurt could it contain? An afterthought invitation to view wedding photos? A defensive justification for my exclusion? I set my phone face down and tried to return to my work, but the unread message pulsed like a presence in the room. Eventually, I took 3 deep breaths, a technique Dr. Nolan had taught me, and tapped the screen. Kaya, I found something while helping Mom and Dad pack for their move to the smaller house. The text read, "You need to know why they've treated you differently all these years. This is going to be hard to read, but you deserve the truth." Attached were photos of handwritten pages, my mother's precise handwriting instantly recognizable, the perfect cursive she'd insisted I practice for hours while Talise was allowed to develop her own style. My finger hovered over the images, heart racing. Did I want to know? Would any explanation change the reality of decades of emotional neglect? And why was Talise suddenly playing truth-teller after participating in my wedding exclusion? After a moment of hesitation that seemed to stretch into eternity, I tapped the first image, the screen brightness intensifying as if to underscore the significance of what I was about to learn. The journal entries dated from before I was born. In tight, controlled script that revealed as much as the words themselves, my mother detailed years of infertility struggles before they'd adopted Talise. The joy of finally having a daughter after believing they would never be parents. The elaborate plans they had made for their perfect family, plans that included adopting a second child, specifically a boy they planned to name after my father. Then came the unexpected news of my mother's pregnancy with me. What should have been another joy was instead described as a disruption of their carefully constructed family narrative. They had been in the process of adopting a second child, a son they had already named and prepared for. Because of my unexpected arrival, that adoption fell through due to agency rules about handling new pregnancies during adoption processes. "I should feel grateful for this baby," my mother had written, the words like a knife between my ribs. "But all I feel is resentment. She's taken the son we chose away from us." I look at her and see the family we were supposed to have, not the one we do have. My hands shook so badly I dropped the phone, the device landing face down on my sketchbook with a dull thud. I sat perfectly still, suddenly aware of the sound of my own breathing, harsh and shallow in the quiet studio. The revelation expanding in my chest like a dark balloon. I had been resented from before my first breath, not for anything I'd done, not for any quality I possessed or lacked, but simply for existing when they'd planned for someone else. I picked up the phone again, forcing myself to continue reading. The journal entries spanned years, documenting my mother's ongoing struggle to bond with me while Talise remained the child we chose. One entry from when I was 5 particularly gutted me. I try not to show it, but I can't help comparing them. "Talise is everything we wanted. Kaya reminds me of our loss." Another entry, dated around my 10th birthday, revealed an additional layer. "Kaya's teacher says she has exceptional artistic talent. Victor thinks it comes from my mother's side, all that Lakota craft tradition I tried so hard to distance myself from." Another way she pulls us backward instead of forward. I sat motionless in my studio chair, the afternoon light shifting across the floor as minutes or perhaps hours passed. All my life, I'd believed there was something inherently wrong with me, some fundamental flaw that made me less lovable. Now I understood. It had never been about me at all. I was simply the unwitting catalyst for a grief they had never properly processed, the living reminder of a loss they had never acknowledged. And worse, my artistic nature, the very core of my identity, reminded my mother of the heritage she had rejected in her quest for assimilation. Every painting, every design, every creative impulse I'd followed had unconsciously reinforced her own painful choices. I called Talise immediately, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "We need to talk," I said when she answered after several rings. "Not on the phone, in person." We met the following evening at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop halfway between our apartments. Talise looked different somehow. The golden child aura diminished, dark circles under her eyes suggesting the newlywed glow had already faded. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back simply, none of the polished perfection she usually presented to the world. "I'm sorry," she said as soon as we sat down, pushing a ceramic mug between her hands like she needed something to hold on to. "I should have invited you to the wedding. I let Mom convince me it would be easier, that you might make a scene. I knew it was wrong, but... She trailed off, her characteristic confidence absent. How long have you known? I asked, placing my phone with the journal photos face up on the table between us. I found the journals last week while helping Mom organize for their downsizing, she admitted, not meeting my eyes. I had no idea, Kaya. I always knew they favored me, but I never understood why until now. As we talked, nursing cooling coffees neither of us drank, I realized Talise had her own complex relationship with our parents' favoritism. The golden child pedestal had come with pressures I hadn't recognized, expectations of perfection, the burden of being the investment that had to yield returns, the constant awareness that their happiness depended on her achievements. I was never allowed to fail, she said quietly, a lock of hair falling across her face. Remember when I wanted to quit violin in 8th grade? Mom cried for days, told me I was throwing away their sacrifices. You got to quit piano lessons after 3 months. Because they didn't care what I did, I pointed out, an edge in my voice I couldn't suppress. I know, Talise nodded, pulling her sweater tighter like armor. I'm not saying it was worse for me, just different. They controlled my every move while ignoring yours. Neither of us got what we needed. She reached across the table, hesitantly touching my hand with cool fingers. I'm not showing you these journals to hurt you, but you deserve to know it wasn't you. It was never you. Those 5 words, it was never you, landed with the force of absolution. The terrible freedom of realizing that the rejection I'd experienced had nothing to do with my worth and everything to do with my parents' unresolved grief and shame. After our meeting, I spent days processing what I'd learned. I took time off work, walking miles along Venice Beach each morning, the rhythmic crash of waves providing a soundtrack to my swirling thoughts. The knowledge didn't immediately heal the wounds of my childhood, but it reframed them entirely. My parents' treatment wasn't a reflection of my inadequacy. It was evidence of their inability to process loss and accept the unexpected. 2 weeks later, I requested a meeting with my parents. I chose Griffith Park, neutral territory where we could talk privately, but in public enough that emotions might stay contained. When they arrived, looking apprehensive in matching beige outfits that blended perfectly with the autumn landscape, I could see them with new eyes. Not as the godlike figures of my childhood who had the power to determine my value, but as flawed humans struggling with their own pain. I know about the adoption that fell through, I said without preamble. I've read Mom's journals. The color drained from my mother's face so quickly I thought she might faint. My father reached for her hand in what appeared to be an automatic gesture of support, but his eyes revealed stark terror. The look of someone whose carefully constructed reality was collapsing. I'm not here for your love anymore, I continued, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. I'm here to return the shame that belongs to you, not me. What happened before I was born wasn't my fault. Your inability to love me fully wasn't because I was unlovable. My mother's face hardened into defensive lines I knew all too well. You don't understand what we went through, she began, her voice taking on the familiar dismissive tone. No, I don't, I agreed, surprising her with my calm. And you never understood what I went through either. That's the difference. I'm willing to try to understand your pain. You never tried to understand mine. My father surprised me by breaking down, his carefully maintained corporate facade crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. Tears streaked down his lined face as he removed his glasses with shaking hands. We thought we were hiding it, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We didn't realize how obvious our preference was. It was obvious to everyone, I said quietly, especially to me. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line as she stared at the ground. We did the best we could, she said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears, and she didn't meet my eyes as she spoke them. Your best was shaped by unresolved grief, I replied, neither accusing nor absolving. But that doesn't change the impact it had on me. I didn't stay long. This meeting wasn't about reconciliation, at least not yet. It was about truth and closure, about returning misplaced shame to its rightful owners. As I walked away from them, back straight and head high, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I'd finally put down a burden I'd been carrying since before I had conscious memory. The burden of believing I was fundamentally unlovable. A year passed, seasons changing in their reliable cycle from the scorching Los Angeles summer through a brief, rainy winter and back to spring. The revelation about my birth had provided context for my family's dysfunction, but the real healing came from rebuilding my life on my own terms, intentionally, mindfully, with full awareness of both the wounds I carried and the strengths they had inadvertently given me. My art evolved dramatically in that year of transformation. The raw emotion of those first beach house paintings developed into a cohesive body of work I titled The Invisible Daughter, a collection that explored themes of absence, identity, and reclamation. A small gallery in Silver Lake, impressed by the emotional depth of the work, offered me a solo exhibition, my first. The opening night arrived on a perfect April evening, the air scented with jasmine and possibility. The gallery was filled with people who had chosen to be part of my life, friends who valued me, colleagues who respected my work, students from my community art classes who looked up to me. This was my chosen family, people who saw me clearly and loved what they saw without condition or comparison. My relationship with Talise had transformed too. The shared knowledge of our parents' failure had created an unexpected bond between us. We weren't best friends. Too much history stood between us for that simple solution. But we were building something authentic for the first time. She came to the exhibition opening with her husband, genuinely proud of my achievement in a way that was distinctly different from our parents' conditional approval. "These are incredible, Kaya," she said, standing before a large canvas that depicted a translucent figure gradually becoming solid and vibrant toward the edges of the frame. "You've always been the artist I wished I could be." The admission of envy, something she'd never acknowledged during our childhood competition, created a small bridge across decades of enforced distance. For the first time, I could see that the golden child pedestal had been its own kind of prison. My parents were not at the exhibition. We maintained limited, carefully boundaried contact now, occasional phone calls, brief visits structured around specific activities rather than emotional exchange. They had apologized in their way, but some wounds go too deep for simple forgiveness to heal. Perhaps someday we would find a new relationship, but it would never be based on my desperate need for their approval or their expectation of fulfilling their disrupted plans through me. As I stood in that gallery surrounded by my work and my chosen family, watching strangers engage emotionally with art that had emerged from my deepest pain, I realized that being erased from that wedding had been the catalyst I needed to create my authentic life. The exclusion that had once broken my heart had ultimately set me free. The evidence was all around me. My worth was no longer tied to my family's validation. I began speaking at community centers about family favoritism and its impact, helping others identify patterns in their own families. So many people approached me after these talks, their eyes showing that flash of recognition, finally having words for an experience they thought was uniquely their pain. "You've described my entire childhood," one woman told me, tears streaming down her face. "I never knew other people felt this invisible too." My studio apartment became a warm, creative haven that reflected my authentic self rather than my mother's aesthetic preferences. Walls painted in colors that energized me, furniture arranged for comfort rather than appearance, shelves filled with books my father would dismiss as irrelevant, each element a declaration of independence from the family narrative that had confined me. I started a small mentorship program for young artists struggling with family disapproval, creating the support system I wished I'd had during my own early creative development. Each step was another brick in the foundation of a life built on self-acceptance rather than external validation. The journey wasn't always smooth. There were still days when the old pain resurfaced, when I questioned my worth or longed for the unconditional parental love I'd never had. but those moments no longer defined me. They were just weather passing through the landscape of a life that was increasingly my own creation. On the anniversary of Talisa's wedding, the day I'd been excluded, I took myself to the beach at sunset. I built a small fire in one of the designated pits and wrote down all the limiting beliefs I'd absorbed from my family. One by one, I burned them, watching the paper curl and disintegrate in the flames. With each one, I whispered, "This isn't mine to carry anymore." As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant orange and pink, I felt a profound peace settle over me. The family that couldn't see my value had given me an unexpected gift, the freedom to discover it for myself. My grandmother's words echoed in my memory. "Remember who you are, Kimimila." Your worth was never in question. I held her beaded bracelet to the fading light, watching how the colors transformed in the sunset glow, blues deepening, golds igniting. In that moment, I understood that being unseen by some doesn't mean you're invisible to all. Sometimes, the greatest blessings come disguised as rejection, forcing us to find our own light when others can't or won't see it for us. Has family favoritism shaped your story? You're not alone. The golden child and scapegoat dynamic exists in so many families, leaving invisible scars that can last a lifetime. But your worth isn't determined by your family's ability to recognize it. I've shared my journey from exclusion to empowerment not because it's unique, but because it's painfully common. So many of us have felt the sting of being less favored, less seen, less valued by the people who should have loved us most unconditionally. Share your experience in the comments below. What was your turning point? When did you realize the problem wasn't your worth, but their inability to see it? The most inspiring story will be featured in our community spotlight because these experiences deserve to be witnessed and validated. For those still struggling with family favoritism dynamics, remember this. Sometimes the greatest gift is being underestimated. Those who weren't given everything often develop the strength, creativity, and resilience that the golden children never needed to cultivate. Your family may have written the first chapters of your story, but they don't get to write the ending. That power belongs to you alone. If you found value in this video, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. This community is for everyone who has felt invisible but is ready to be truly seen. Together, we're rewriting our stories, not as family outcasts, but as the heroes of our own powerful journeys. Remember, the fact that someone couldn't love you properly doesn't mean you're unlovable. It means they were limited in their capacity to love. And that limitation belongs to them, not to you.